She can't hear a thing, her father slurred to the laughing crowd. That's what everyone believes. Emily Carter lowered her eyes and tightened her fingers around the worn canvas grocery bag hanging from her wrist. The late autumn wind swept through the downtown street market, carrying the smell of roasted nuts, coffee, and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Neon lights reflected across damp pavement, while shoppers hurried past without giving the young woman a second glance. She had become invisible years ago. Invisible people were rarely noticed, and that was exactly how her father wanted it. Harold Carter stumbled beside her with another half-empty bottle tucked beneath his old coat, loudly repeating the same story to strangers willing to spare a dollar. "My poor deaf daughter," he said with exaggerated sorrow. "Life's been cruel to her." Some offered sympathy. Some quietly walked away. Emily never argued, never nodded, never reacted. Her silence had become a prison built one brick at a time until even the people who once knew her forgot what her real voice sounded like. Every morning she stocked shelves at a neighborhood grocery store before sunrise. Every evening she cleaned tables at a family diner 2 miles away. She worked nearly 16 hours a day, yet the tiny apartment she rented with her father still felt one missed paycheck away from disappearing. The manager at the diner believed she couldn't hear instructions, so co-workers pointed instead of speaking. Customers smiled politely and overpronounced every word. Emily simply smiled back with quiet kindness that somehow made people feel guilty without understanding why. The truth rested beneath that silence like something sleeping beneath frozen water. She heard far more than anyone imagined. She heard whispers, footsteps, birds settling onto power lines, the rustle of dollar bills sliding into cash registers. Yet whenever ordinary voices reached her ears, they became strangely distant, as though spoken from behind thick glass. Doctors had called it an impossible condition. Specialists tested her for years before giving up. Eventually everyone accepted the easiest explanation. She was deaf. Emily stopped correcting them long ago because correcting people never changed anything. That Friday night the market was unusually crowded. Holiday decorations glowed above Main Street, while musicians played cheerful songs beneath strings of white lights. Children laughed. Vendors shouted daily specials. Somewhere nearby a church bell announced 8 o'clock. Emily instinctively turned her head toward the sound before immediately looking back down. No one noticed. Or so she believed. Across the street, traffic suddenly slowed. One black SUV rolled silently around the corner, followed by another, then another. Their polished surfaces reflected the city lights like moving mirrors. Conversations faded. Vendors stopped calling customers. People instinctively stepped aside without understanding why. The vehicles stopped with impossible precision beside the fountain at the center of the square. Men wearing perfectly tailored black coats exited first. They moved with disciplined calm, scanning rooftops, windows, and every face in sight. Their posture wasn't military exactly. It was older. Sharper. Like guardians following rules written centuries before anyone standing there had been born. Then the rear passenger door opened. A man stepped onto the sidewalk whose presence seemed to pull the warmth from the evening air. He stood well over 6.5 feet tall with pale skin almost luminous beneath the streetlights, dark hair brushed neatly behind one ear, and calm silver eyes that never wandered without purpose. His charcoal overcoat settled around broad shoulders as though the wind itself refused to disturb him. Nobody spoke his name, yet everyone instinctively lowered their voices. Emily kept staring at the pavement. Harold laughed loudly, pointing toward the newcomer. "Doesn't matter who's here," he shouted for everyone to hear. "My girl can't hear anybody anyway." The towering stranger never looked at Harold. His gaze settled quietly on Emily instead. And for reasons she could never explain, her heartbeat changed. Emily lowered her eyes again, willing her pulse to slow. Yet the strange rhythm inside her chest refused to obey. She had spent years teaching herself never to attract attention, blend into the crowd, finish the shift, pay the bills, survive another day. Those simple rules had carried her through every disappointment life had placed before her. Tonight, for the first time in years, those rules no longer seemed enough. The tall stranger remained perfectly still beside the fountain, saying nothing while the men around him quietly formed an invisible circle. No one crossed it. Even the children chasing one another moments earlier stopped running, pulled back by parents who suddenly felt an instinctive need to leave space around the newcomer. Harold noticed the silence and laughed louder. "Look at that," he called out, swaying slightly as he pointed toward Emily. "You can talk all you want. She will never hear a word." Several uncomfortable smiles spread through the nearby crowd. Some people looked away. Others stared at Emily with familiar pity. She kept her expression calm. Pity had become another language she understood too well. Then something unusual happened. A paper coffee cup slipped from a customer's hand nearly 20 feet behind her. It struck the sidewalk with a sharp crack before rolling across the pavement. Emily's eyes shifted toward the sound without thinking. The movement lasted less than a second. She immediately looked back down. Nobody seemed to notice. Nobody except the silver-eyed stranger. His expression did not change, but something inside those pale eyes sharpened. He had not been watching the crowd. He had been watching her. One of the men beside him leaned forward as though asking a question. The stranger answered with the smallest shake of his head. Whatever words passed between them remained completely silent. Harold continued performing for anyone willing to listen. "Doctors tried everything," he announced dramatically. "Nothing worked. Poor thing has lived in silence her whole life." Emily closed her fingers tighter around the grocery bag until the paper handles creased against her skin. Every sentence felt strangely heavier tonight, not because of her father's familiar story, but because the stranger refused to stop looking at her. It was not the cold curiosity she had seen from doctors or social workers. It was recognition. As though he had discovered something he had been searching for much longer than she had been alive. The evening breeze drifted across the square, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. The towering man finally began walking. His long strides were calm, unhurried, almost effortless. Every person instinctively stepped aside before he reached them. No commands were spoken. None were necessary. Emily counted each footstep without understanding why. 10 feet away. 8, 6, 4. Her breathing grew shallower. Harold stepped between them with an awkward smile. "Sir, there is nothing to see here," he said. "My daughter cannot even hear you." The stranger stopped only inches away. His attention never shifted toward Harold. Instead, his silver eyes remained fixed on Emily, calm as moonlight reflecting across still water. For several endless seconds neither of them moved. The market noise slowly returned around them, yet somehow it felt impossibly distant. Emily could no longer hear the musicians. She no longer noticed the conversations, the traffic, or the laughter. There was only the silence between them. Then the stranger leaned forward just enough that nobody else could possibly hear his voice. His words were softer than the wind passing through the holiday lights, softer than falling snow. "Emily," he whispered with complete certainty, as though he had always known her name. Every muscle in her body froze. Her breathing caught. She had never met this man before. She was absolutely certain of it. Yet hearing her own name spoken in that impossibly quiet voice felt clearer than every sound she had struggled to understand for the last 15 years combined. Emily's eyes lifted before she could stop herself. It was the smallest movement, barely enough for anyone else to notice, but the silver-eyed stranger saw everything. She stared directly into his face for the first time. He looked younger than the ancient authority surrounding him suggested, perhaps no older than 35 by human appearance. Yet there was something timeless hidden behind those calm silver eyes. They carried neither pity nor suspicion. They carried certainty. Emily's heartbeat pounded so loudly that she almost missed the next whisper. "You have been pretending for a very long time." The words drifted toward her like falling snow. Perfectly clear. Perfectly effortless. Every syllable reached her without distortion. No mafeldecos. No invisible wall. No exhausting struggle to understand. She heard him exactly as though he were the only voice left in the world. A tiny breath escaped her lips before she could hide it. The stranger noticed. So did no one else. Harold laughed again, completely unaware of the silent conversation unfolding inches away from him. "See," he told several bystanders. "Nothing. She cannot hear anybody." Emily wanted to look away. She wanted to return to the safe silence she had hidden inside for years. Instead, she remained frozen beneath the stranger's steady gaze. Questions flooded her mind. Who was he? How did he know her name? Why was his voice different from every other voice she had ever heard? Ever since childhood, ordinary conversations had always sounded distant, blurred together like words spoken through heavy rain. Teachers believed she ignored them. Doctors called her condition unexplained. Specialists filled notebooks with observations before quietly admitting they had no answers. Yet this man's whisper reached her more clearly than her own father's shouting. It should have been impossible. One of the men in black approached cautiously. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "the council is waiting." The silver-eyed stranger did not answer immediately. His attention remained on Emily. "They can wait," he replied. His voice was calm, but the simple sentence changed the atmosphere around him. Even his own attendants exchanged quick glances without speaking. Harold blinked in confusion. "Your Majesty," he repeated under his breath, suddenly realizing this visitor was far more important than he had imagined. Nearby shoppers slowly recognized the title as well. Whispers spread through the square. Nobody dared say the name aloud, but everyone understood. The ruler of an unseen kingdom was standing in the middle of an ordinary American city, speaking only to a quiet grocery clerk. Everyone believed could not hear. Emily felt the weight of hundreds of curious eyes settling upon her. She instinctively stepped backward. The stranger made no attempt to stop her. Instead, he studied her with unexpected patience, almost as though he understood exactly how frightened she felt. "You have nothing to fear from me," he said softly. Again, every word reached her with impossible clarity. Emily swallowed hard. For 15 years she had never answered anyone in public. Speaking now would destroy the story that had protected her from endless questions. Remaining silent suddenly felt equally dangerous. The wind shifted once more. High above the square, dozens of holiday lights swayed together. One fragile glass ornament loosened from its ribbon and began falling from nearly 30 feet overhead. People continued talking, unaware. Emily heard the tiny snap of the ribbon before anyone else noticed. Without thinking, she took 2 quick steps forward and raised one hand. The ornament struck her palm instead of shattering across the sidewalk. The entire movement lasted less than 2 seconds. Silence spread across the square. Emily slowly lowered her hand and stared at the unbroken ornament resting against her fingers. Then she realized everyone was looking at her, but only one face showed surprise. The silver-eyed king did not look shocked at all. He looked as though everything had just happened exactly the way he expected. Emily stared at the small glass ornament resting safely in her hand as though it belonged to someone else. She had reacted without thinking. Years of hiding had disappeared in a single heartbeat. Around her, conversations faded into uneasy silence. A little girl standing beside the fountain tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "How did she know it was falling?" Her mother had no answer. Harold blinked several times, confusion replacing the performance he had maintained for years. "Emily," he muttered, "how did you?" He stopped before finishing the question because he did not have an explanation that fit the story he had told everyone, including himself. The towering king slowly stepped closer, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the stone pavement. Emily instinctively expected fear when he approached. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar. Calm. It settled over her like warmth after standing outside on a freezing morning. He looked at the ornament still resting in her trembling fingers before lifting his eyes to meet hers again. "You heard it break free," he said quietly. It was not a question. Emily's lips parted slightly. For years, every specialist had insisted she could not possibly hear sounds that ordinary people missed while struggling to understand voices spoken directly beside her. Yet this stranger had understood her condition within minutes. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to retreat into silence once more. But the truth had already stepped into the light. Harold forced an uneasy laugh. "Lucky guess," he said quickly, trying to recover. "Anybody could have." His voice faded as the silver-eyed king finally looked at him. There was no anger in that calm expression. No threat. Only quiet authority that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. Harold lowered his eyes almost immediately. The king returned his attention to Emily. "You have spent years believing something inside you was broken," he said softly. "It never was." Emily felt those words more deeply than she expected. Every hospital visit. Every confusing examination. Every disappointed look from teachers and neighbors. Every lonely night wondering why the world always sounded so distant. They all came rushing back at once. She tightened her grip on the ornament until she realized she was holding it too firmly, then carefully relaxed her fingers. "Who are you?" she whispered before she could stop herself. The words left her lips so quietly that even she barely recognized her own voice. Several people nearby gasped. Harold stared at her as though he had seen a ghost. For the first time in over 15 years, Emily Carter had spoken in public. The king's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My name is Lucian Ashcroft," he replied. "And I have been searching for someone like you for a very long time." The sentence settled over the square like a gentle snowfall. None of the bystanders understood its meaning, yet every one of them sensed its importance. One of Lucian's advisors stepped closer, concern briefly crossing his face. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "if the council learns about this before we understand what she is, they will intervene." Lucian did not look away from Emily. "They already know," he answered calmly. "They have known since the moment she heard my voice." A sudden breeze swept across the market. Decorative lights flickered overhead. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang once again. This time Emily heard every single note with perfect clarity. Not because the bells had changed, but because something inside her had begun to awaken. She looked toward the darkening sky, then back at Lucian. Deep within those clear silver eyes she saw no pity, no judgment, and no desire to control her future. She saw recognition, as though an invisible door that had remained sealed her entire life had quietly begun to open, and neither of them could stop what was about to come next. Emily stood perfectly still while the evening seemed to hold its breath around her. The holiday lights continued glowing above the square, yet the warmth they had offered only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Every face in the crowd carried the same expression: curiosity, confusion, expectation. Lucian Ashcroft remained calm, his silver eyes never leaving Emily's face, while his advisors exchanged increasingly uneasy glances. One of them, an older man with snow-white hair and a perfectly tailored black coat, stepped closer before lowering his voice. "Your Majesty, we should leave immediately. If the houses receive confirmation before we return, they will send representatives." Lucian answered without turning his head. "They already have." The older advisor's expression tightened. Emily did not understand what that meant, but she recognized genuine concern when she heard it. Harold suddenly found his voice again. "Wait just a minute," he said, forcing a nervous smile as he stepped beside his daughter. "If everybody is so interested in Emily, maybe someone can explain what is happening. She is just an ordinary girl." Lucian finally looked at him. "No," he replied with quiet certainty. "She has never been ordinary." Those 6 words landed harder than any accusation. Harold stared speechless. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Ordinary was the only thing she had ever wanted to be. Ordinary people did not become the center of attention in crowded city squares. Ordinary people finished work, paid rent, and disappeared into tomorrow. Yet every instinct inside her warned that tomorrow no longer existed. Another black vehicle rolled silently into the square. 2 more men wearing dark coats stepped out, but unlike Lucian's attendants, their expressions were colder. They stopped several yards away without crossing the invisible boundary surrounding the king. The older advisor noticed them first. "They arrived faster than expected," he murmured. Lucian gave the slightest nod. "Observe only," he said. "No confrontación." Emily followed his gaze. The newcomers watched her with unsettling focus, almost as though she had become the answer to a question they had spent years trying to solve. She instinctively stepped backward until her shoulder brushed the stone edge of the fountain. The cool surface grounded her racing thoughts. Lucian noticed the movement immediately. "You are safe," he said softly. Once again, every word reached her with impossible clarity. The surrounding conversations blurred into distant echoes, yet his voice remained perfectly sharp. Emily realized something else had changed. She could now distinguish individual sounds hidden inside the evening. Water flowing beneath the fountain. Leaves brushing against one another high above the street. The gentle ticking of the large clock mounted on City Hall nearly half a block away. It was as though an invisible curtain had begun lifting from the world. She looked up in quiet disbelief. "It is happening sooner than I hoped," Lucian said almost to himself. Emily turned back toward him. "What is happening?" she asked. Speaking felt strange after so many silent years, yet each sentence came more easily than the last. Lucian studied her carefully before answering. "Your hearing was never lost. It was waiting." Emily frowned. Waiting for what? Before Lucian could respond, the older advisor's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the color slowly drained from his face. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the council has issued an immediate summons. They are demanding the girl be brought before them tonight." Silence followed. Even the fountain seemed quieter. Lucian slipped one hand into the pocket of his overcoat, considering the message without visible emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty that had unraveled Emily's entire world only moments before. "Inform the council," he said, "that Emily Carter is under my personal protection until I decide otherwise." Every advisor froze. The newcomers across the square exchanged alarmed looks. Harold blinked in stunned confusion. Emily simply stared at Lucian, realizing she had no idea why one of the most powerful men she had ever met had chosen to stand between her and people she had never even known existed. Edit. Emily searched Lucian's face for even the smallest sign that he regretted what he had just declared. She found none. His expression remained steady, composed, almost impossibly calm, while the people surrounding him reacted as though the evening itself had changed direction. The older advisor lowered his phone slowly. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "they will interpret this as a direct refusal." Lucian answered without hesitation. "That is exactly how I intend them to interpret it." The words settled over the square with quiet certainty. Emily did not understand who the council truly was, but she understood the weight carried by everyone else's silence. Even Harold sensed it. He nervously rubbed his hands together before forcing another uncertain smile. "Look," he said, "if my daughter is important to all of you, maybe we can work something out." Lucian finally turned toward him. "This is not a negotiation." His voice never rose, yet Harold instinctively stepped backward. There was no threat in those words, only unshakable authority. Emily watched her father lower his eyes for what felt like the first time in her life. Before anyone spoke again, another sound reached her ears. A faint metallic chime echoed somewhere beyond the surrounding buildings. She looked toward the rooftops without thinking. "What is it?" Lucian asked immediately. Emily frowned. Someone opened a heavy iron gate. Several advisors exchanged puzzled looks. The older man quietly shook his head. "There are no iron gates within 3 blocks. Lucian remained thoughtful instead of dismissing her answer. Barely 10 seconds later, the distant rumble of an old delivery truck rolled into view from an alley across the street. Its rear cargo door had been secured by a rusted iron latch that now swung loosely against the metal frame, producing the exact chime Emily had described. Every advisor turned toward her in astonishment. She had heard it long before anyone else could. Emily stared at the truck, equally surprised by herself. "This is impossible," she whispered. Lucian answered gently. "No. It is simply unfamiliar." The fountain continued flowing behind them while the city seemed sharper than it had ever been before. Emily could distinguish the flutter of pigeons settling onto a nearby church roof nearly a quarter-mile away. She could hear a street musician tuning a guitar somewhere beyond the next intersection. Individual voices separated from the crowd instead of blending together into meaningless noise. The world had not become louder. It had become clearer. "Why is this happening?" she asked quietly. Lucian looked toward the evening sky before answering. "Because your gift is no longer sleeping." Emily repeated the unfamiliar word to herself. "Gift." "Generations ago," Lucian said, "there were rare people whose senses awakened only in the presence of a royal bloodline. They did not lose their hearing. Their hearing waited for the right voice." Emily felt a chill despite the calm evening air. "You mean this has happened before?" Lucian nodded once. "Very rarely." "Then why me?" For the first time since arriving, uncertainty crossed his face. It lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing again. That is the question I have spent many years trying to answer. The older advisor stepped closer once more. Your Majesty, another message. Lucian accepted the small device without taking his eyes from Emily. He read only a single line before quietly closing the screen. They are no longer requesting her presence, he said. They are sending observers. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken again. Observers. Lucian slipped the device back into his coat. People who will smile politely while searching for every reason to decide whether you are a miracle, a mystery, or a threat. Emily lowered her eyes toward the ornament she still carried in one hand. Only an hour earlier she had been worrying about tomorrow's grocery shift, and whether she had enough money left to buy milk before work. Now strangers she had never met were crossing unseen boundaries simply because she had heard one impossible whisper. She slowly looked back at Lucian. If they decide I am a threat, she asked softly, what happens then? Lucian held her gaze without the slightest hesitation. Then they will first have to convince me that they are right. Emily tried to steady her breathing, but the question she had just asked refused to leave her mind. A threat. The word echoed differently now. Only hours ago it had meant overdue rent, another exhausting shift, or wondering whether the refrigerator would have enough food for the week. Tonight it meant something far larger, something hidden beneath the ordinary world she thought she understood. Lucian's answer lingered between them with quiet certainty. He had not promised that nothing dangerous existed. He had only promised that she would not face it alone. For reasons she could not explain, that difference mattered. A gentle breeze swept across the square, carrying the scent of pine from the enormous Christmas tree standing near City Hall. Emily suddenly realized she could hear hundreds of tiny ornaments brushing softly against one another high above the crowd. Every delicate sound floated through the air with astonishing clarity. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. The city no longer sounded confusing. It sounded alive. When she opened them again, Lucian was watching her with thoughtful patience. Your senses are adjusting, he said. Do not fight them. Emily nodded slowly. Everything is louder. Lucian gave the slightest smile. Not louder. More honest. Before she could ask what he meant, a familiar voice interrupted the quiet. Emily. Harold stepped closer, his expression unusually serious. The confidence he had carried all evening had disappeared, replaced by nervous uncertainty. He looked from Lucian back to his daughter several times before speaking again. If these people think you are important, maybe this is our chance. Emily frowned. Our chance for what? Harold hesitated only a moment. A better life. Money. A house. Security. People this powerful always reward those who help them. Emily felt something sink inside her chest. For years she had hoped that one day her father would see her as more than another difficult burden life had handed him. Listening to him now, she realized he was looking at her exactly the way the strangers across the square were. As something valuable. As something that could change his future. Lucian remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. Emily looked directly at her father. You are talking about me like I am an opportunity. Harold quickly shook his head. That is not what I meant. But even he did not sound convinced by his own answer. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before Emily heard another unfamiliar sound. Somewhere beyond the crowded square, several synchronized footsteps echoed against concrete. They were measured, perfectly even, almost impossible to mistake. She instinctively turned toward a narrow side street leading away from the market. Someone is coming, she whispered. Lucian followed her gaze immediately. His advisor stiffened without asking questions. Barely 15 seconds later, 6 elegantly dressed men and women appeared at the end of the street. They walked with calm precision, their expressions polite, their movements graceful enough to draw attention without seeming theatrical. Every one of them wore a small silver pin shaped like a crescent moon. They stopped together several yards away. None smiled. None spoke. Yet their arrival changed the atmosphere more completely than any raised voice could have. The older advisor quietly exhaled. The first delegation. Lucian nodded. Once. Earlier than expected. One of the newcomers, a distinguished woman with silver hair and an ivory coat, stepped forward before offering a respectful bow toward Lucian. Your Majesty, she said warmly. The council sends its greetings. Her voice sounded pleasant, almost comforting. Emily listened carefully. Unlike Lucian's voice, this one reached her as though traveling through heavy mist. She understood every word, but the strange effortless clarity was gone. Lucian noticed the subtle change in Emily's expression. Without taking his eyes off the delegation, he quietly asked, "Can you hear her?" Emily answered honestly, "Yes." She paused before adding the detail that made Lucian's calm expression sharpen for the first time that evening. "But not the way I hear you." For one brief heartbeat, every advisor around the king stopped breathing. Even the silver-haired woman across the square lost the polite smile she had carefully maintained. Whatever Emily had just revealed was far more important than she yet understood. The silence that followed Emily's answer lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt as though the entire city had stopped breathing. The silver-haired representative studied Emily with renewed interest, no longer hiding the calculation behind her warm smile. Around her, the other delegates exchanged nearly imperceptible glances. They had expected confirmation. Instead, they had discovered a difference none of them seemed prepared to explain. Lucian remained perfectly composed. "Thank you," he said softly to Emily. She looked up at him confused. "For what?" "For telling the truth before fear had the chance to speak for you." His words settled gently into her thoughts. Fear had ruled much of her life. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of disappointing another doctor. Fear of becoming another burden. Tonight, for the first time, honesty had somehow become safer than silence. The silver-haired woman folded her hands gracefully. "Your Majesty," she said with measured politeness, "the council has no wish to disturb the young woman. We merely request a brief conversation under proper observation." Lucian's expression did not change. "You requested custody less than 15 minutes ago." The woman offered a courteous smile that never reached her eyes. New information often changes old decisions. Emily listened carefully. The delegate's voice still carried that strange distance, as though every sentence had to cross a river before reaching her ears. Lucian's voice remained entirely different. Every word arrived effortlessly, clear enough to feel almost tangible. She finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been growing inside her mind. "Why can I hear you differently?" Several advisors lowered their eyes. Even the council delegates remained unusually quiet. Lucian answered without hesitation. "Because my voice is opening something that has remained closed since you were born." Emily searched his face. "You keep saying that, but you never tell me what it is." Lucian took one slow step closer. "Because I would rather show you than force you to believe a story that sounds impossible." Before Emily could respond, the soft melody of the church clock echoed across downtown once again. 8 gentle chimes drifted through the cool evening air. Emily instinctively counted each one. Then another sound slipped quietly beneath them. A child's laughter floated from nearly a block away, followed by the flutter of wings as a flock of pigeons lifted into the night sky. She heard every detail separately, perfectly. Her eyes widened. "I can separate them now," she whispered. "Every sound." Lucian gave a small approving nod. "Your mind is adapting faster than expected." One of his younger advisors looked genuinely astonished. "No recorded awakening has ever progressed this quickly." The silver-haired delegate immediately responded, "Which is precisely why she belongs under the council's protection." Lucian calmly met her gaze. "She belongs to herself." The simple sentence seemed to ripple through everyone present. Emily felt something inside her loosen, something she had carried for so many years that she had forgotten it was there. Nobody had ever said those words about her before. Not teachers, not doctors, not even family. She belongs to herself. Harold shifted uneasily behind her. His eyes moved from Lucian to the council delegates and back again, measuring possibilities instead of emotions. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Lucian. Without embarrassing Harold, Lucian quietly moved one step until he stood naturally between Emily and the gathering delegates. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to the crowd, yet Emily understood its meaning without explanation. Protection did not always require dramatic speeches. Sometimes it was simply choosing where to stand. At that exact moment, a faint sound brushed against Emily's hearing. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was neither a voice nor music. It resembled an ancient melody carried by the wind itself, impossibly old and impossibly gentle. She slowly turned toward the dark skyline beyond the city lights. "Do you hear it?" she asked quietly. Lucian's expression changed for the first time that evening. Surprise flickered across his face before giving way to something far deeper. Recognition. "No," he answered honestly. "Only you can." Emily listened again as the mysterious melody grew just slightly clearer, carrying with it the strange feeling that somewhere beyond the sleeping city, someone had been waiting a very long time for her to finally hear it. Emily remained perfectly still as the mysterious melody drifted across the night once more. It did not come from the church. It did not come from the busy streets surrounding the square. It seemed to exist somewhere beyond the ordinary world, carried through the wind like an ancient memory finally finding its way home. Every other sound around her slowly faded into the background. The conversations, the traffic, the fountain, even the holiday music playing from nearby storefronts seemed to soften until only the strange melody remained. She closed her eyes without thinking. The tune felt familiar despite the certainty that she had never heard it before. It stirred something deep inside her, something older than memory itself. Then, for the first time that evening, another sound emerged from within the melody. A voice. Calm, gentle, ageless. It did not echo through the square. It echoed inside her mind. "At last," the voice whispered. Emily's eyes flew open. She instinctively looked around the crowded plaza. Nobody appeared to notice anything unusual. Lucian watched her carefully. "Emily?" he asked. She swallowed. "Someone just spoke." Lucian frowned. "I did not say anything." Emily slowly shook her head. "Not you." The silver-haired delegate immediately stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we must conclude this meeting now." There was urgency beneath her carefully controlled tone. "This development cannot continue in public." Lucian never took his eyes off Emily. "What did the voice say?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Only 2 words. At last." Silence settled over everyone standing near the fountain. Several of Lucian's advisors exchanged deeply troubled expressions. The oldest among them quietly removed his glasses before looking toward the dark skyline. "I have only read about this," he murmured almost to himself. Lucian finally turned toward him. "You believe the old records?" The advisor answered with surprising confidence. "Tonight I no longer know what to doubt." Emily barely heard them. The melody had returned once again, softer now, drifting farther away as though inviting her to follow. Along with it came a sensation unlike anything she had experienced before. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It felt like recognition. As though somewhere beyond the city lights, beyond the highways and neighborhoods she had known her entire life, a forgotten place had quietly remembered her name. Harold looked at his daughter with uncertain eyes. "Emily," he said carefully, "we should just go home." She turned toward him. Home. The tiny apartment. The grocery store. The diner. The life she had woken up expecting only a few hours earlier suddenly felt impossibly distant. Not because she no longer wanted it, but because the world she believed was complete had revealed another hidden layer beneath it. Lucian stepped beside her without hurry. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said. "Your future still belongs to you." Emily looked up at him. "Will I ever understand what is happening to me?" Lucian held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Yes." His voice remained as clear to her as ever. But understanding usually arrives one step after courage. Emily nodded slowly. Somewhere high above the square, the clouds finally opened. A light rain began falling, each tiny drop tapping softly against the pavement. She heard every one of them. Hundreds. Then thousands. Each sound perfectly separate. Perfectly alive. She lifted one hand into the cool rain, watching the droplets gather across her fingers while the mysterious melody slowly disappeared into the distance. Just before it vanished completely, the ancient voice returned one final time. It spoke only her name. Not Emily. A different name. Older. Stranger. A name that awakened something deep within her heart before fading into silence. Emily lowered her hand and looked toward the dark horizon beyond the city lights. She did not recognize the name, But somehow she knew with absolute certainty that one day she would answer to it.